Ben Bradlow is Postdoctoral Fellow at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. We'll be discussing a recent article from his dissertation project called Weapons of the Strong, Elite Resistance and the Neo-Apartheid City. Ben, welcome. Before we dive into things, give us a quick tour of your background and your current work.
Yeah, so first, thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I'm currently I'm doing a postdoc. I recently completed my PhD in sociology at Brown University and was prior to that trained as an urban planner. But I also worked for a long time in Joburg and Cape Town but first as a journalist actually, and then most of my time was spent working for an organization called Shack Dwellers International or Slum Dwellers International, which is an international network of housing movements, mostly in Africa and Asia, and a bit in South America. So yeah, I come to this work as an urbanist from a number of disciplinary perspectives. And this article comes out of a project that was my dissertation and is now a book manuscript that compares the politics of inequality in Joburg and São Paulo in Brazil after transitions to democracy. You know, the big picture question that motivates the book is, why are some cities more effective at reducing inequality than other cities? And the reason why I picked Joburg and Sao Paulo for this study was because Brazil and South Africa had some interesting similarities in their transitions to democracy. And in particular, I'm referring to the role of urban movements and neighborhood associations in cities, in the poorest neighborhoods of cities, as a key component of what some of the academic literature refers to as a social movement unionist alliance that drove democratization. So in South Africa, we know about COSATU, we know about the ANC, and we know about the UDF. And one of the key components of the UDF were the street committees, the civics, the urban organizations in townships and urban townships that were part of the struggle for democracy and the end of apartheid. And Joburg and Sao Paulo, I realized, had some very similar degrees of inequality in the distribution of public goods in each city. So when I talk about public goods, or the kinds of public goods that I examine in this book, they're housing, sanitation, and collective transportation. And the basic setup for the book is that Sao Paulo ended up being more of a positive case in reducing inequalities to those goods after transitions to democracy over the last 25, 30 years. And Joburg is more of a negative case. And this is surprising for a few reasons, but one key reason, which helps set the stage for this article that we're going to discuss, is many observers who were comparing Brazil and South Africa in the early 90s were predicting that South Africa actually was more likely to be effective in reducing inequality, in part because of such a clear articulation between the question of class and the question of race. So because race was so embedded in the distributional questions that were driving both urban policy and a whole range of transformations of the state in South Africa, people expected there's overwhelming legitimacy. You have a majority Black government. It will be very hard to challenge attempts at redistribution, and therefore we should expect a better outcome in South Africa and in a city like Joburg.
So take us on a tour of this project. What is it about and what are the key takeaways?
Yeah, so the way that the paper is framed, the whole kind of Brazil question is not part of this paper. I wrote it just about Joburg. The question in that sense is, well, why after a political transformation that seemed to offer so much of a strong basis for redistribution was the apartheid spatial trajectory of distributing public goods in the city, reproduced in the post-apartheid era, such that we can speak. I'm definitely not the first person to describe Joburg as a neo-apartheid city. That is a common frame. Some might dispute certain elements of it, but the basic contours, I think, are mostly indisputable. So that's kind of the question that motivates this. And in particular, what I emphasize is that there was this alignment between demands for both racial recognition and racial redistribution and a class-based redistribution. And in the kind of the built environment of most South African cities, and especially in Joburg, these things overlap to an extent that we could, this was legally by design under apartheid, that race and class should overlap in the spatial organization of the city. So yeah, that's kind of what motivates the paper. And we can think of Joburg in South Africa in that sense as a very extreme case, a most likely case where you would expect to see redistribution in a highly unequal context have at least some modicum of success because of that strong articulation of race and class, and where you have a transition to a majority Black government in '94. And so what the paper does is it documents what I call weapons of the strong. Now, there's a reason why I use that term, which in a way is a bit of a cheap academic trick, which is that weapons of the weak is a kind of quote unquote famous book by a political scientist and anthropologist named James Scott, who, when he used that term, he was describing peasants in Southeast Asia and how they have very hidden forms of resistance against landowners. So the idea is that because they are so weak, they have to use very hidden forms of resistance. And his insight was to uncover those forms of resistance. What I'm doing here is saying that actually elites, in the case of Joburg, were in a situation where they had to pursue very hidden forms of resistance to a new democratic dispensation in the local state that was very keen on pursuing redistributive policies. So there's a kind of lame irony that academics pursue there. And the reason why elites had to pursue hidden strategies of resistance is precisely because of the strong articulation of race and class in pursuing a redistributive agenda in post-transition Joburg. So when I talk about elites, the people I'm talking about are almost all white. They're both neighborhood associations in wealthy neighborhoods, or in kind of the South African way that we talk about cities, it would be called a suburb. And so neighborhood associations and property developers. So one thing that I want to emphasize about those two groups is that they're not always natural allies. We know that in a number of contexts, the kind of classic not in my backyard fight is between neighborhood associations in relatively wealthy residential neighborhoods and property developers, either who are developing housing for low-income people or for commercial development. So it's originally a lot of the NIMBY stuff was about stopping commercial development. And that's not what we find in the kinds of alliances, at least, that I uncover in Joburg. It's much more about unifying both white property developers and white neighborhood associations around a common goal of preventing a more strong redistribution agenda from the city, particularly in terms of cross-subsidizing from wealthy areas to invest in poor areas, as well as a broader spatial transformation agenda that reduces both the class and race segregation of the city.
What are weapons of the strong, and what is implied in this concept?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, the kind of broad stroke idea is that these are relatively hidden forms of resistance that elites, traditional white elites, deployed in Joburg to reduce the effectiveness of attempts at redistribution-oriented reforms. And what I find are two types of strategies. So the first I call ring fencing, and the second I call venue shopping. So ring fencing, the kind of basic story here is that some of your viewers and listeners may remember this history if they're old enough, that in the mid-90s and coming out in the kind of negotiation of the transition to democracy, there was a relatively temporary compromise in Joburg that said there would be sub-municipalities that would have specific powers within the broader unified Joburg municipality. So one of the key questions coming out of apartheid was, how are you going to unify all of these disparate local governments that were designed to be fragmented in order that white areas have their own local government, Black areas have their own local government. A lot of the protests in the 80s and early 90s were all about the perceived illegitimacy of Black local authorities in the townships, which were very, they were quite horrible in terms of providing public goods to residents. And so that question of unifying the city was resolved in a very compromised manner. One thing that I track is that neighborhood associations and developers took advantage of this institution of sub-municipalities, which were kind of the front line for a number of services, including collecting tax and rates payments. And what these early, were and are still called city improvement districts negotiated with the sub-municipal structures is that rates payments could be ring-fenced only to be spent in the sub-municipal area. So, some of the kind of wealthiest, relatively inner core suburbs in the north of Johannesburg, like Ilovo, Melrose, Rosebank, these are some of the areas where this started, Sandton. So you kind of get a sense that these are some of the traditional wealthy areas of the city. And these are some of the areas that have been kind of the biggest beneficiaries of the post-apartheid development trajectory of the city, both in terms of private investment and public investment. And that was kind of kicked off by this intent to ring fence rates contributions so that they could not effectively cross-subsidize investments by the city, the central city government in other parts of the city. Now, the sub-municipal arrangement was a temporary arrangement. It ended in about 2000 when there was a much more deeper unification of the administrative apparatus of the city into what's now referred to as a metropolitan municipality. But what happened in those early years is that the city was putting a lot of money into capital investments in the poorest townships in the city. But the problem, as we know, with infrastructure investment, it's not just the capital investment, it's operating investment, the operating costs. And for that, you need a much more sustainable financial arrangement at the central city in order to manage those kinds of things effectively. And this paper doesn't even get into some of the more high profile issues in fiscal management of the city of Joburg, most notably in terms of electricity billing. So that's ring fencing. The second strategy is what I call venue shopping. And what the city tried to do, especially in the early 2000s, to begin to get control over the spatial trajectory of private development. which was stretching the bulk infrastructure of the city, was to say, okay, we want to have an urban development boundary. And this, in fact, this was one of the first major attempts of the city at a form of spatial transformation, though it's a really kind of light touch approach compared to other things that have been discussed within the frame of things like corridors of freedom, which became more popular in the 2010s and things like that. But so the city had an urban development boundary, but private developers wanted to develop in, you know, kind of emblematic areas either in the west of the city or in the far north of the city, and they wanted to develop in areas beyond the urban development boundary. And what private developers realized is that they could get approvals for their projects from the Gauteng provincial government, essentially bypassing the city government. So eventually, that's what I mean by venue shopping. They could choose their venue from which to secure a project approval. So the city eventually took the province to court, and this all related to a national law, the Development Facilitation Act. And eventually the Constitutional Court determined that the Development Facilitation Act gives the final authority for these approvals if there's a conflict between a city and a province to the city. But even then, groups like the South African Property Owners Association, SAPOA, submitted an amicus curiae to the Constitutional Court that was accepted by the Constitutional Court. And in doing so, it created a number of administrative hurdles to actually implement this decision. So things like setting up an independent planning tribunal that could assess these permits in case of a conflict between city and province took many years, and actually the full court decision has yet today to be fully implemented by the city government. So these are, what I'm trying to draw out for you in describing this is that there are path dependencies from relatively early conflicts in the post-apartheid history that continue to play out today in terms of the capacity of the city government. And just the one kind of twist that I would put at the end, and this is kind of like this is beyond the scope of the paper, which ends more or less in 2016 with the end of unified ANC control of the government and the local government, is that by the end of this period, when you're getting into the mid-2010s and into 2020, you have a much more kind of open relationship between wealthy neighborhood associations, developers, and the city government, such that neighborhood associations act in ways that are much more empowered and explicit to oppose policies of the city than they did in the 90s, especially in the 90s. And you have a much closer kind of relationship, actually, between the city government and the property developer sector, which is very different than the kinds of relationships between developers and city government that I found in the period that I was looking at ending in about 2016.
So why was Joburg chosen as the site for this inquiry? What is it about Joburg's history that makes it the perfect place to explore the concept of weapons of the strong?
So Joburg is useful for this kind of study in part because of the history of struggle in Joburg. So that's kind of like the bigger picture. And maybe I can bring in some of the personal motivation, because this isn't just an intellectual motivation. My family is South African. My parents moved back to South Africa about almost 12 years ago. And I've been going to South Africa, either living there or visiting, my entire life. All of these dreams of Nelson Mandela, the ANC, the struggle against apartheid, so much of my own political consciousness is formed around learning about this history. And the question that I have is, well, why are these dreams not realized, essentially? There are a lot of key things that have changed in South Africa since '94, but I think everybody feels quite clearly that there's a lot that people's dreams were not fulfilled in a lot of. And Joburg was the center of a lot of the struggle, particularly at the urban scale, where when you talk about the role of street committees and civics, when SANCO, the South African National Civics Organization, was a strong independent organization that was largely driven by its affiliates in Joburg. The UDF was really dominated by a lot of activism in Joburg. And so it's in Joburg where you would expect, it's kind of the key test case for what can this kind of struggle history at the urban scale produce when you move into government. And one of the key stories one of the key dimensions of this story is the very explicit demobilization of the social movement basis for democratization in a city like Joburg that happened after the transition to democracy. So it's not just that you have these relatively hidden strategies of what I'm calling elite resistance, but it's that the city government, because there was this very explicit decision by the ANC to demobilize and disband the UDF, to have a very kind of hands-off relationship with housing movements in the townships after democratization, the city government is left on its own. It has no social movement backers to defend it against these attacks from traditional white elites. So it's that history of struggle that really shapes this story, even if the main thing that I end up analyzing is the strategies that are deployed by elites in this case.
You focus on private property developers and neighborhood associations to demonstrate tactics of elite resistance. Are there other stakeholder groups through which this can be identified, and how do the tactics differ?
It really depends on the issue area and the policy sphere that we're looking at. I mean, what I look at is, in this paper, it's about residential space. It's about the distribution of things like toilets, the condition of housing. And when you're talking about things like housing and utilities and their distribution across urban space, which is really meaning urban land, then we're talking about a very key set of interest groups. And so the key interest group for this kind of policy conflict that I'm looking at are the people who have a very clear interest in what kind of more Marx-inspired scholars would refer to as the exchange value of land, or we can even just think of that as the market, the land market. And so in that sense, neighborhood associations and property developers are the key kind of actor that we would expect to be involved in preserving the market value of land, which they perceive in both a class-based term, and there's this clear racial component to it as well in a context like South Africa.
So what are the potential solutions? What can government do to respond? How can people respond?
The way that I want to answer this question you might think it's a bit indirect, but I'm trained as a planner. I get the kind of technical discussions around, well, we should design cities this way or we should design cities that way, and I think that's all very important. I really like getting into those technical details, but the story here is really a political story. There's a very senior professor in Brazil who has a podcast like this that he calls Fora da Política não há salvação, which means outside of politics, there's no salvation. And that's kind of what I think is actually often missing in a lot of the urbanist debates in South Africa. And what I'm referring to here is the ANC is a critical actor. And we can't kind of try to come up with solutions that don't engage the fact that the ANC is the central actor politically in the construction and wielding of state institutions. So one of the key things that I've kind of alluded to already is the relationship between the ANC and social movements is really quite dysfunctional. And it's gotten to the point where there's no movement basis, which in effect means there's no active political constituency that's pushing for the kind of programmatic, citywide, technical policy changes that would be required to undo these spatial legacies. And, you know, a lot of the international literature refers to South Africa and even Joburg in particular as a protest capital of the world. There are service delivery protests all the time, but these are very localized protests. There's no real citywide level organization that can link together this strong activist impulse into a set of policy demands. And the dominant political party is not oriented towards integrating those kinds of demands into the way that it functions in wielding the organs of the state. And I think until you get to that kind of relationship, which some people refer to as an embedded type of political institutional relationship, it's going to be very difficult to overcome what remain truly massive inequalities in a city like Joburg.